When people imagine widowhood, they often picture quiet afternoons, well-meaning neighbors dropping off casseroles, and children who rally around with sympathy and support. My reality was nothing like that. At 58, I found myself standing in the middle of a house that had grown unbearably silent, clutching a cardigan of David's that still smelled faintly of him, and realizing that nothing about my life would ever be the same again. David had been my anchor, my constant for 32 years. He wasn't perfect. He had a tendency to lose track of time in the garage, fiddling with an engine until midnight, and he sometimes forgot anniversaries unless I nudged him. But he loved me with a steadiness that made everything else bearable. His laugh had filled our kitchen every Sunday morning as we sat with coffee and the newspaper. His hand would find mine automatically whenever we walked into a crowded place, and in all those years, not once did I doubt his devotion. When he died of a sudden heart attack, the world didn't just tilt. It collapsed in on itself, leaving me stranded in the rubble. The days after the funeral blurred together. I remember people's voices more than their faces. The pastor telling me to take comfort in the Lord, neighbors murmuring how strong I was, distant cousins commenting on how time heals. I hated those words. Time heals. It was such a lazy thing to say to someone who had lost the person they loved most. What did they know about time, when every hour without David felt like sandpaper against my skin? The house, once my sanctuary, became unbearable. I couldn't walk past the garden without seeing David kneeling among the roses, humming to himself as he pruned the bushes. I couldn't sit at the dining table without glancing at his empty chair and waiting for him to ask if there was more bread. Nights were the worst. I would turn over in bed and my hand would land on cold sheets where his warmth should have been. The silence pressed down on me until I thought I would suffocate. So, when my son Alan suggested I come stay with him and Cassandra, I accepted. I told myself it would be temporary, just until I could sort through the finances and decide what to do next. "You'll always have a place with us, Mom," Alan had said over the phone, his voice flat but polite, as if he were reciting a line. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe my child meant it. Alan had always been quieter than his sister, more reserved, the kind of boy who clung to my hand at birthday parties because he was afraid of balloons popping. As a teenager, he grew into his silence, and while his grades were steady, his confidence never was. I had been the one to remind him that he was capable, to push him to apply to college when he doubted himself, to tell him over and over that he could make something of his life. Maybe that's why it cut so deeply later, when I realized how easily he chose Cassandra's side over mine. Cassandra was a different story. From the moment Alan introduced her, I could sense her unease around me. She was sharp, polished, with a permanent smile that never quite reached her eyes. During family dinners, she had a way of steering Alan's attention back to her whenever he asked me about something. She once told me, straight-faced, that Sunday visits were too much pressure on their schedules, and Alan had simply nodded along. Over time, I saw less and less of my son. I told myself it was marriage, that it was natural for a man to prioritize his wife, but some small part of me had always wondered if Cassandra resented me for being in the picture at all. The first week living with them, I tried my best to make myself useful. I cooked dinners, folded laundry, even trimmed the hedges in their yard. Cassandra never said thank you. She would glance at the meals I prepared, point out that there was too much butter in the potatoes, or that Alan was trying to watch his carbs, and then slide the serving dish away. I caught her rolling her eyes once when I asked where she kept the mop. Alan stayed silent, often excusing himself to his office after dinner, leaving me alone with the clatter of Cassandra's disapproval. Still, I told myself I could endure it. I had lost my husband. I didn't want to lose my son, too. The night it all came to a head, the tension had been simmering for days. Cassandra had been sighing louder, Alan more withdrawn, and I could feel the storm building even before we sat down at the table. The meal was simple: grilled chicken, salad, a half-empty basket of rolls. I tried to start a conversation about David. about how much he had loved family dinners, but my words dropped into the silence like stones into a well. Cassandra's fork clicked against her plate as she set it down, her expression tight. "Barbara," she said suddenly, her tone sharp, "we need to be realistic here." I froze. "Realistic?" She folded her arms, leaning back. "This arrangement isn't working. We can't afford to keep supporting you. Alan and I have our own lives, our own responsibilities. You're an extra mouth to cook for, and frankly, it's a strain." I felt the blood drain from my face. My son sat across from me, his head bowed, his fork still in his hand, but not moving. "Alan?" I whispered. He cleared his throat, his voice low, almost embarrassed. "Cassandra's right, Mom. Things are tight right now. You should think about finding your own place." It was like being doused with ice water. I stared at him, waiting for him to take it back, to tell me that of course I could stay, that of course I belonged. But he didn't. He looked at me with eyes that wouldn't meet mine, as though he were ashamed, but not enough to change his mind. Cassandra leaned forward, her lips curving with something close to satisfaction. "It's not personal, Barbara. It's just practical. We can't have extra burdens. You understand?" I didn't understand. Not at all. How could they reduce me, their mother, their family to a burden? My voice trembled, but I forced the words out. "After everything I've done for you, Alan? After all these years?" He flinched just slightly, but said nothing. I stood, my chair scraping against the floor. "I'll pack my things." No one stopped me. Cassandra picked up her fork again. Alan stared down at his plate, and I walked down the hall with my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. In the little guest room, I grabbed my suitcases, already half-packed, because some part of me had known this day was coming, and zipped them shut. My hands shook as I carried them to the front door. For one last moment, I lingered. I waited, hoping Alan would appear, that he would say, "Mom, wait. Please don't go tonight." But the only sounds that reached me were the quiet clinks of cutlery and Cassandra's low laugh. I opened the door and stepped into the cool night air, the weight of my suitcases pulling at my arms. Behind me, the house glowed warmly, but it wasn't my home. It never had been. My home had been with David, and that life was gone. As I walked down the driveway, I felt stripped bare. Everything I had given, every sacrifice, every night of worry, every meal cooked and bill paid and tear wiped from Alan's face when he was a boy, meant nothing now. I was just an old woman with 2 suitcases and nowhere to belong. And for the first time since David's death, I realized I wasn't just grieving him. I was grieving the family I thought I had. The motel room smelled faintly of bleach and something sour that never quite left, no matter how often the maid came by with her spray bottle. The carpet was worn in patches, a dull brown with darker stains that made me wonder about the lives of the people who had stayed there before me. The curtains were heavy and mismatched, one side sagging lower than the other. A single queen-sized bed sat in the middle, its thin blanket tucked too tightly, the kind that felt like paper when I tried to pull it up around my shoulders at night. It wasn't home, not by any stretch of imagination, but it was all I could afford. The first night, I sat on the edge of the bed with my suitcases beside me, staring at the cracked lampshade as if it held answers. I told myself it was temporary, a week, maybe 2, until I found work. But as the days bled into nights and the weeks stretched longer, I began to feel the weight of my new reality pressing down. At 58, with no career history beyond homemaking and a few part-time cashier jobs decades ago, the world had no use for me. Each morning, I woke early, dressed in my best skirt and blouse, and walked the streets with a stack of resumes I had printed at the library. Grocery stores, coffee shops, even cleaning services. Everywhere I went, the managers gave me the same polite smile, the same tight shake of the head. "We're not hiring right now. We need someone with more recent experience. You'll hear back from us if something opens up." But no one ever called. By evening, I returned to the motel with sore feet and empty hands. I'd sit on the bed and stare at the faded floral wallpaper, listening to the muffled voices of other tenants through the thin walls. Sometimes it was a couple arguing, sometimes a baby crying, sometimes laughter that made me ache with longing. I ate whatever was cheapest from the vending machine or a plastic-wrapped sandwich from the gas station across the street. And when I finally lay down, the silence of the room swallowed me whole. It was the shame that hurt most of all. Shame that I had nowhere to go. Shame that my son had pushed me out so easily. Shame that I was reduced to counting coins to decide between dinner and laundry. Nights were the hardest. That was when the loneliness crept in like a fog. I would curl on the bed, clutching David's cardigan, the one thing of his I had managed to pack, and close my eyes, pretending I could still feel his warmth. The memories kept me alive. I thought of our early years, when David and I scraped together enough to buy our first house. We had no money, but we had determination. I remembered him carrying me across the threshold, even though we both laughed at how silly it was. His arms strong around me, his grin wide. I remembered the nights we stayed up late painting the nursery for Alan, choosing a soft yellow because we didn't know if it would be a boy or girl, and wanted it to be perfect either way. Sometimes, when the nights grew unbearable, I spoke aloud as if David could hear me. "You wouldn't have let them do this, would you?" I whispered into the darkness. "You would have told Cassandra exactly what you thought of her. And Alan, maybe he would have listened to you." But David was gone, and all I had were echoes. After a month of rejection and despair, I began going through my belongings more carefully, almost as if searching for comfort in the familiar. One rainy afternoon, when the sound of water dripping from the gutter outside seemed to match the hollow rhythm of my heart, I opened my second suitcase and pulled out a box of keepsakes I had tucked in almost without thinking the night I left Alan's house. Inside were photographs, birthday cards, and a few old books that had belonged to my mother. One of those books was a diary. The cover was plain brown leather, worn soft with age, and tied shut with a thin strap. I hadn't thought about it in years. My mother had kept diaries for most of her life, but after she passed away, I only skimmed through a few pages before tucking them into storage. I suppose I had been too busy raising my children then, too busy surviving. Now, with time stretching endlessly before me, I opened it. The handwriting was her neat cursive, looping and elegant, every letter carefully shaped. At first, the entries were mundane. Recipes she wanted to try, notes about neighbors, complaints about the cost of groceries. But as I read further, something shifted. March 12th, 1974. One entry began. "I saw HJS again today. He insisted on meeting in secret, as always. He says he has put everything in place for me, but I don't know whether to believe him. Part of me hopes Barbara will never need it, but another part of me fears she might." I frowned, reading the words over and over. HJS. The initials meant nothing to me. My mother had been a simple woman, a homemaker, quiet and reserved. Who could this mysterious man have been? Flipping ahead, I found another mention. April 27th, 1974. HJS told me not to speak of the inheritance, not to anyone, not even to David. He says there will be documents one day, proof that cannot be contested. I feel guilty keeping this from my family, but he insists it is for Barbara's future, not mine. My heart raced as I stared at the page. Inheritance, proof, documents. My mother had never spoken of this to me. Growing up, our life had been modest, every penny carefully stretched. If there had been money or property or anything hidden away, she had never once let it show. And yet here it was, in her own careful handwriting, hinting at something I had never known existed. I turned the pages faster, hungry for more. May 15th, 1975. I worry sometimes about HJS, whether I can trust him. But he has always kept his word so far. He said the account would be safe, that no one but Barbara could touch it when the time came. I pray that day never arrives, but if it does, I hope she forgives me for keeping this secret. I set the diary down, my hands trembling. The motel room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing closer. My mother had died when I was in my 30s, and in all those years, I had never once suspected she was hiding something of this magnitude. A hidden inheritance? An account in my name? And who was this HJS? The initials haunted me. I scribbled them on a scrap of motel stationery, trying different names aloud. Henry James Smith, Harold John Sanders, Howard Joseph Scott. None sounded familiar. Yet the way she wrote about him, the secrecy, the insistence on silence, it wasn't the tone of a casual acquaintance. It felt deliberate, purposeful, almost protective. That night, lying awake on the stiff motel bed, I thought about everything I had lost, everything I was struggling for. I thought about Alan and Cassandra sitting in their comfortable house, eating their carefully portioned dinners, never wondering if their mother had enough to eat. And I thought about my mother, quietly hiding away something meant for me. For the first time in weeks, I felt something stir inside me. Not hope, not yet, but a spark. A question that demanded an answer. Who was HJS, and what exactly had he left for me? When I woke the next morning, the diary still lay open on the nightstand, its pages faintly wrinkled from my restless hands. The initials, HJS, stared up at me like a riddle I could not put down. I barely slept, my mind circling the same questions. Who was he? Why had my mother never told me? And what did she mean by an inheritance that was meant for me alone? For years, I had lived under the impression that my family's history was ordinary. My mother was a quiet woman, my father a factory worker who died when I was still a teenager, and I had never questioned that story. But now, staring at the delicate cursive in my mother's diary, I felt as though the ground beneath my past was cracking open. By noon, I could no longer sit still. I packed the diary into my bag and walked across town to the office of an old family acquaintance, Louis Patterson, an attorney who had handled small legal matters for neighbors when I was a girl. His name had appeared in my mother's notes, written once in the margin of a page that mentioned HJS, as if she had intended me to find it one day. Lewis's office was on the second floor of a narrow brick building downtown. The sign outside was faded, Patterson and Associates, Family and Estate Law. Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of old books and lemon polish. A young secretary looked up as I entered. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "but please tell Mr. Patterson, it's Barbara Hayes." He knew my mother. Minutes later, I was shown into a wood-paneled office where Lewis himself stood behind a cluttered desk. He was older now, perhaps in his 70s, with thinning hair and thick glasses that made his eyes seem magnified. When he saw me, his face softened. "Barbara," he said warmly. "My goodness, I haven't seen you since your mother's funeral. You're the spitting image of her." The words nearly undid me. I sat down in the chair across from him, clutching my bag. "Mr. Patterson, Lewis, I need to ask you something. It's about my mother's diary. I found entries. They mentioned someone with the initials HJS and an inheritance that was meant for me. Do you know what that means?" He leaned back slowly, removing his glasses. For a moment, he simply studied me, as if weighing whether I was ready for the answer. Finally, he sighed. "So she never told you?" "Told me what?" "That your father, the man you thought was your father, was not your biological father." His words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. "Barbara, your real father was a man named Harry James Stays." I shook my head, the name unfamiliar, yet strangely commanding. "Harry Stays?" "You may have heard of him," Lewis said carefully. "He was a prominent businessman. Real estate, investments, even a small manufacturing empire in his day. He passed away years ago, but his name still carries weight in this city." The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the arms of the chair. "You're saying he was my father?" "Yes," Lewis confirmed gently. Your mother kept it secret to protect you. Harry Stays was a married man at the time of their relationship, and the scandal would have destroyed her reputation and his business. But he did not abandon her. On the contrary, he ensured provisions were made for you through a trustee. Your mother came to me to make sure it was legal, and I've been waiting, frankly, for the day you might come here. I stared at him, stunned into silence. All my life, I had believed my father was an ordinary man who worked long hours at the factory and came home smelling of oil. Now, in the span of a few sentences, that picture had been shattered. My mother had carried this truth to her grave, and Lewis had guarded it like a sentinel all these years. Lewis opened a drawer and pulled out a file, thick with papers yellowed by age. This is what your mother left in my care. Trust documents, account statements, letters from Mr. Stays himself. You are the beneficiary of assets placed in your name long ago. They have grown considerably over the decades. My breath caught. How much are we talking about? He adjusted his glasses again and handed me a sheet. As of the last quarterly report, the total value of accounts, investments, and real estate comes to just over $1.3 million. The paper blurred in front of my eyes. $1 million. More money than I had ever seen, more than I had ever imagined belonging to me. Just days ago, I had been counting coins to buy stale sandwiches. Now Lewis was telling me I was a woman of wealth. I don't understand, I whispered. Why me? Why didn't he acknowledge me? Because of the times, Louis said quietly. Because powerful men often chose silence over scandal. But he did not forget you. He made sure you would one day stand on your own. Your mother insisted it remain hidden until you were truly in need. She trusted that you would know when that time had come. Tears pricked at my eyes. In need. If she could see me now, in a cheap motel, cast out by my own son, surely she would know this was that time. Lewis pushed the file toward me. Everything is here. We will need to process some paperwork, but the accounts are active. You have access to checking, savings, a portfolio of investments, and 3 properties held in trust. 2 are small rental houses, and 1 is a larger estate outside the city, all legally yours. I sat back, numb. The shame and helplessness that had clung to me for weeks began to loosen, replaced by something I hadn't felt in years. Power. The knowledge that I was not powerless, not dependent, not the discarded burden Cassandra had painted me to be. I had resources. I had options. Louis studied me carefully. Barbara, I know this is overwhelming. Take your time. But you should also know, this is not charity. This is your inheritance, your birthright. Don't let anyone make you feel unworthy of it. I swallowed hard, nodding. For the first time since David's death, I felt the stirring of strength. Not borrowed strength, not the fragile kind that cracks under pressure, but something solid, something rooted in truth. That evening, back in the motel, I spread the papers across the bed like a map to a new life. Bank statements with numbers that made my head spin, property deeds with my name printed clearly, letters signed HJS in strong, confident handwriting. The initials that had once seemed a mystery now stood before me as a legacy. I sat in silence, the hum of the motel's air conditioner filling the room, and let the truth wash over me. My mother had kept her secret to protect me. My father had been a man of power, and he had left me the means to stand tall. And now, after weeks of humiliation and despair, I was no longer just a woman abandoned by her son. I was Barbara Stays, heir to a fortune, and I was going to use it. The day I walked out of Lewis's office with that thick folder pressed to my chest, I felt the world differently. The streets no longer seemed hostile. The strangers no longer looked at me like I was invisible. The shame that had clung to me like a second skin began to peel away, leaving behind something firmer, something steadier. For the first time in months, I was not thinking about where my next meal would come from, or how many days I could stretch the money in my wallet. Instead, I was thinking of possibilities. Lewis had urged me to take things slowly, to ease into this new reality, but I knew I couldn't linger in paralysis. My life had been controlled for too long, by grief, by dependency, by the condescension of my daughter-in-law, and the cowardice of my son. I was finished letting others decide my place. The first step was moving out of the motel. I rented a modest furnished apartment downtown, nothing extravagant but clean and quiet, with a proper kitchen and a small balcony where I could drink my coffee in the mornings. Signing the lease with money from an account that bore my name alone felt like drawing a line in the sand. This was my life now, and I would not shrink from it. The second step was purpose. For weeks, I had woken with no aim but survival. Now, with assets at my disposal, I asked myself what I wanted to build. David had always said I was the practical one, the planner, the one who thought ahead while he tinkered in the garage. I remembered the pride I felt when I balanced our household budget down to the cent, when I stretched his modest salary to cover Alan's tuition, when I kept everything afloat with sheer determination. If I could manage all that with so little, what might I do with more than $1 million? I went back to Louis, sat across from his tidy desk, and told him what I wanted. I want to establish a company, I said firmly, a proper legal entity, something I can use to invest, to buy property, to grow what's been left to me. He raised his brows, but I saw approval flicker in his eyes. That is a wise decision. It will give you structure, protection, and legitimacy. Within 2 weeks, paperwork was filed, and Stays Holdings, LLC, was born. My father's name, my name, finally put to use not as a shadowy secret, but as a banner I could claim. And then came the moment that felt almost scripted by fate. Lewis called me one afternoon, his voice calm but charged. "Barbara, I thought you might like to know. The house where your son and Cassandra live is going to auction. They've fallen behind on mortgage payments. You'll want to move quickly if you're interested." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The image of that dining room flashed before me. Cassandra's cold smile, Alan's bowed head, the words that had cut me down. "We can't support you. You're an extra mouth to cook for." And now, the very roof over their heads was slipping away. "Send me the details," I said quietly. The auction was held in a bland municipal building, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the air thick with the smell of coffee and dust. I sat in the back, wearing a simple navy suit, my hair pulled neatly into a bun. No one recognized me. To them, I was just another bidder. But inside, my heart pounded with a strange mix of nerves and certainty. The bidding began low, then climbed. A few investors raised their hands half-heartedly, but I raised mine higher. When the final number was called, it was mine. The house that Alan and Cassandra had once lorded over me, the place where I had been dismissed and humiliated, was now signed over to Stays Holdings, LLC. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I simply signed the papers and walked out, the deed tucked into my folder. It wasn't revenge I felt. It was justice. A shifting of the ground, a rebalancing of the scales. The following week, official notices went out. Cassandra and Alan were informed that their mortgage had been foreclosed and that their property now belonged to a new owner. They were welcome to stay, as tenants. But the rent was no longer what they had paid before. It had tripled. I imagined Cassandra's face when she read the letter, the way her carefully composed smile would collapse into fury. I imagined Alan's panic, the way his voice would tremble when he tried to explain the impossible math of their new expenses. I imagined them finally understanding, if only faintly, what it felt like to be vulnerable, to live at the mercy of another's decisions. 2 days later, my phone began to ring. Alan's name lit up the screen again and again. The first time, my heart leapt. My old instinct to answer, to comfort, to mother. But then, I remembered the night I had stood in their doorway with my suitcases, waiting for him to stop me, waiting for a word of kindness that never came. I let it ring. The second time, I silenced it without hesitation. The third time, I blocked the number. It wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. My son had chosen his side, And now he would learn what consequences felt like. Later, Louis called to update me. "They're furious, Barbara." Cassandra especially. She accused me of conspiring against them when she learned you were the owner. I told her plainly, "This is business. Nothing more, nothing less." I thanked him, my voice calm. Inside there was no gloating, no triumph, just a quiet steadiness. I wasn't seeking their suffering. I wasn't dancing on their downfall. I was ensuring that the respect they had stripped from me would be restored by circumstance. That night, sitting on the balcony of my apartment, I thought about the woman I had been just weeks earlier, the mother trembling in a cheap motel, clutching a cardigan for warmth. That woman was still inside me, but she no longer controlled me. The diary, the lawyer, the inheritance, they had not simply given me money. They had given me something I thought I had lost forever: dignity. And now, as the city lights twinkled below, I whispered into the night, not to Alan or Cassandra, but to David and to my mother. They wanted me gone. Now they'll live under my roof. Not because I want revenge, but because I want them to feel the weight of their choices. I will not be erased. For the first time in months, I felt not just alive, but whole. It happened on a Tuesday morning, just after sunrise. I had been awake since 4, sipping coffee on my balcony, watching the city slowly stir itself awake. The streets below carried buses and delivery trucks, people in coats hurrying toward lives they could not imagine abandoning their mothers from. And as I sat there, a thought came to me with quiet certainty. It was time to stop hiding behind the company name. It was time to step, quietly and deliberately, into Alan's and Cassandra's lives again, not as their discarded mother, but as the owner of the house where they slept. I didn't announce myself. I didn't call. Instead, I drove out to their neighborhood and parked across the street from the 2-story home that had once been a place of humiliation for me. The shutters were freshly painted, the grass neatly trimmed, but I could already see the stress etched into the yard. An overstuffed trash bin, a second-hand sedan parked in the driveway instead of Cassandra's flashy leased SUV, curtains pulled tightly across the windows as if they were hiding from the world. I stood at the curb for a long time before walking up the path. My heart hammered in my chest, but my steps were steady. When Cassandra opened the door, her face froze. "You!" she spat, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Good morning," I said evenly, holding the folder of documents under my arm. "I'm here on business." Her mouth twisted. "Business? You're trespassing. You don't belong here." "That's where you're wrong," I replied quietly. I handed her the official notice, a copy of the deed, stamped and signed, with Stays Holdings, LLC, printed clearly at the top. "This property belongs to me now." For a long moment, she stared at the paper as though it might burst into flames. Her manicured hands trembled, and then she shoved it back toward me. No, this is some mistake, some scheme. Who even are you to come here and—" She stopped, eyes darting across the bold lettering. "Stays Holdings. That name again." Behind her, Alan appeared in the hallway. His face looked older somehow, lined with shadows beneath his eyes, his shoulders slumped. He wasn't the boy I raised. He wasn't even the man I remembered from the funeral. He looked worn down, drained, as though the house itself were leaching the energy out of him. "Mom!" he whispered, his voice almost cracking. I met his eyes, and for a split second, my resolve trembled, but I held firm. "Alan, this isn't personal. This is business. I'm your landlord now. You and Cassandra are welcome to stay, provided you pay the rent in full, on time." Cassandra's face went red with fury. "This is insane!" "You orchestrated this, didn't you? You've been plotting all along, playing the victim while sneaking behind our backs." She whirled on Alan. "Do you see what she's doing? She's trying to destroy us." Alan rubbed his temples with both hands, silent. "I didn't plot anything," I said calmly. "I simply took an opportunity when it presented itself. That's what responsible adults do." I let the words hang there, pointed and deliberate. For days afterward, Cassandra launched a campaign of outrage. She called Lewis's office repeatedly, filing complaints, demanding to know who was really behind Stay's holdings. She wrote long, venomous emails to the property management company I'd hired, insisting this was harassment, that they were being victimized. She even posted cryptic rants on social media about parasitic relatives and predatory landlords. None of it mattered. The documents were clear. The law was on my side. Alan, however, didn't rage. He withdrew. When I saw him again, quietly, from across the street one evening when I happened to drive past, he looked like a ghost of himself. His hair was uncombed, his posture slouched, his eyes sunken. The stress of Cassandra's fury and the crushing new rent seemed to be breaking him down piece by piece. And that's when the conflict began inside me. Because for years, Alan had been my baby boy. The child who clung to me when he had nightmares, who whispered, "Don't let go," when I taught him to ride a bike. The man who had once, before Cassandra's influence, called me just to tell me about a book he'd read or a new recipe he'd tried. And now, watching him stagger under the weight of his choices, my heart ached. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the satisfaction that simmered beneath the sorrow. This was justice. This was balance. For every cold look across the dinner table, for every silent nod of agreement when Cassandra dismissed me, for every night I spent alone in that motel, wondering if I mattered at all, this was consequence, and I would not take it back. One afternoon, Alan called again. His number was still blocked, but the property manager forwarded me a voicemail he had left for me, his voice raw with exhaustion. "Mom, please." I don't know what to say anymore. Cassandra's furious all the time, and I can't sleep. I can't think straight. I know I should have stood up for you. I know I should have done more. I was scared. I let her push me, and I didn't fight it. And now everything's falling apart. I just want to talk. I listened to it twice. My hand hovered over the phone, aching to call him back, to tell him I forgave him, to tell him he wasn't lost to me forever. But then I remembered the night he looked at me across that dinner table with indifference in his eyes. "You're an extra mouth to feed." So I didn't call. Instead, I closed my eyes and whispered into the silence, "This isn't revenge. It's responsibility. You need to feel what you've done." The strange thing was, I didn't hate Cassandra either. I had expected to, but as her tantrums grew louder, as her complaints multiplied, as her anger boiled over into wild accusations, all I felt was a cold detachment. She wasn't powerful anymore. She was flailing, and I was steady, immovable, the quiet center of the storm. For the first time in years, I controlled the situation, and for the first time, Alan had no choice but to reckon with his decisions. It was raining the day Alan came to see me. Not a soft drizzle, but a steady, pounding rain that rattled the windows of my apartment and blurred the city skyline into gray streaks. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of tea cooling in my hands when the knock came. 3 sharp raps, followed by silence. For a moment, I froze. Very few people knew where I lived, and fewer still ever came unannounced. I stood slowly, crossed the small living room, and opened the door. There he was. Alan. He looked nothing like the man who had smiled beside Cassandra at their wedding, or even the man who had nodded silently while she dismissed me at the dinner table. His suit was damp and wrinkled, his tie askew, his hair plastered to his forehead from the rain. Dark circles under his eyes made him look 10 years older. For a second, he just stood there, his shoulders sagging, rainwater dripping from his coat onto the hallway floor. "Mom," he said finally, his voice hoarse. I stepped back, leaving the door open. "Come in." He moved inside slowly, as if he were afraid I might change my mind. He glanced around the apartment, his eyes landing on the simple furniture, the neat stack of papers on the coffee table, the faint glow of a lamp by the sofa. I could feel him registering that I was not in some motel anymore, not begging for shelter, but living quietly, independently. "Sit," I said, nodding toward the chair across from mine at the kitchen table. He lowered himself onto it, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The rain filled the silence. Finally, he lifted his head, and the words spilled out. "I let Cassandra drive you away." His voice cracked, and he swallowed hard. "I let her talk over you, decide for me, because I thought it was easier. I wanted to keep the peace. I thought if I stood up to her, if I told her no, she'd turn that anger on me. So I stayed quiet. I let her treat you like you were nothing, and you left. And I didn't stop you." He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. "God, Mom, I hate myself for that." I sat still, my fingers tight around the handle of my mug. His words were what I had longed to hear, and what I had dreaded all at once. A confession. An admission that he had chosen silence, not because he agreed with Cassandra, but because it was easier, because peace in his marriage had mattered more than decency to his mother. Tears blurred my vision before I even realized I was crying. Quiet tears sliding down my cheeks, dripping onto the table. I hadn't wanted him to see me cry again, but this time the tears weren't for my humiliation. They were for the boy I remembered, the boy I had raised, who was now sitting across from me, crushed under the weight of his own choices. "Forgive me," he whispered, lowering his hands to the table. His palms were trembling. "Please, Mom. Please forgive me." The words hung in the air like smoke. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt a storm of emotions rise inside me. Anger at his weakness, sadness for the man he had become, compassion for the son I still loved, though love had been ground down to something sharper, harder. But I said nothing. I didn't say I forgave him, because forgiveness is not a word you hand over lightly, not after months of betrayal. I didn't say I hated him either, because I didn't. I simply remained silent, my tears falling, my breath slow and steady. Alan dropped his gaze. His lips trembled. Then, hesitantly, like a child asking permission, he slid his chair closer to mine and lowered himself onto the floor beside me. He leaned his head against my knee, his shoulders shaking, his voice raw. "I'm so sorry," he murmured again. "I just wanted to keep the peace." I thought she'd calm down, that she'd change, that things would be easier if I let her have her way. But she never changed. She only got worse. And now I've lost you. I let him sit there, his weight against me, his words tumbling out in broken pieces. I didn't push him away, but I didn't reach for him either. My hands remained on the mug in my lap, my silence the only answer I could give. Minutes passed. The rain softened against the windows. Alan's breathing slowed, his sobs quieting. He lifted his head finally, his eyes red and swollen. He looked at me with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for a rope. "Say something," he whispered, but I didn't. Not because I had nothing to say, but because words would have given him comfort too quickly. He needed to sit with the weight of his betrayal, to feel the silence he had forced on me that night when I walked out of his house with 2 suitcases and nowhere to go. He needed to know that silence could be as cutting as any sentence. At last, he stood. Slowly, heavily. He looked around the apartment again, as if trying to memorize it. Then he looked at me one last time. "I don't know if you'll ever forgive me," he said quietly, "but I'll keep trying. I can't keep living like this." And then he left. I sat there long after the door closed, listening to the echo of his footsteps down the hall. My tears had dried, leaving my face stiff. Inside me, emotions churned like a storm at sea. Sorrow, compassion, anger, pride. But beneath them all, there was strength. I had let him sit near me. I had not shut him out completely, but I had not given him what he wanted. And that balance, that control, was mine. Later, I imagined the scene that must have followed in their house. Cassandra demanding to know where he had been, why his eyes were swollen, why he was suddenly less pliant, less eager to please. I imagined the first cracks forming between them, tiny but dangerous, the kind of cracks that spread when pressure mounts. I didn't smile, I didn't cheer. but I felt something steady inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. Power. Not power to crush or to destroy, but power to stand firm, to be unmoved, to know that I was no longer at the mercy of anyone's choices but my own. And as I sat in my quiet apartment, the rain easing into silence, I realized something. I wasn't waiting for reconciliation anymore. If it came, it would be on my terms, in my time. For now, I was content to let the silence speak for me. Cassandra's fury had always been sharp, but now it was unraveling into something darker, something unstable. At first, she confined her outrage to legal letters and complaints, emails written in all capital letters, angry phone calls to the property management office, scathing posts online about predatory companies ruining hardworking families. But as the weeks passed, and her complaints were met with calm professionalism and contracts she could not argue, she began to lose her grip. Anonymous notes started arriving at my apartment. The first one was scrawled in thick black marker on plain printer paper. "You'll pay for this." The second, left under my door late at night, read, "Stays Holdings is a fraud. We know who you are." The threats didn't frighten me as much as they should have. If anything, they confirmed what I already knew. Cassandra was cornered, and a cornered person lashes out. Still, I saved the notes in a folder, each one slipped into a plastic sleeve, just in case the time came when I would need to show the authorities. But the real storm was inside their house. Neighbors whispered about shouting that carried through the walls, about Alan leaving late at night and returning at dawn, about Cassandra's voice shrill and unrelenting. Once, while parked discreetly across the street, I saw her throw a vase onto the porch, shattering it against the railing while Alan stood frozen in the doorway. The tension was breaking them down, and I could see it in Alan's face whenever I caught sight of him, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow, his movements sluggish, as though every step was weighted with regret. One evening, there was another knock at my door. Softer this time, hesitant. I knew before I opened it who it was. Alan stood there, rain-soaked again, his coat unbuttoned, his face pale. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. "Please," he said, his voice raw. "I can't stay there tonight." I let him in. He dropped heavily into the chair at the kitchen table, burying his face in his hands. "She knows," he muttered. "She doesn't have proof, but she knows. She's convinced you're behind everything. She says you conspired with that company, that you set this all up to ruin us. And she won't stop. She doesn't sleep. She doesn't eat. She just rages, day and night. I can't breathe in that house anymore." I poured him tea, set it in front of him, and sat down across from him. For a long time, I watched him tremble, watched the tears he tried to hide. And then I spoke, my voice calm but steady. "Alan, she doesn't need proof." Because she's right, his head jerked up. His eyes widened. "What?" I held his gaze. "I am Stays Holdings. I bought the house. I set the rent. It was me all along." For a moment, silence. He blinked, his lips parting, then closing again. He looked like a man who had been punched in the stomach. "But why?" His voice was barely a whisper. I leaned forward, my hands folded on the table. "Do you remember that night? The night she told me I was just an extra mouth to feed? Do you remember sitting at that table, your fork in your hand, your eyes on your plate while your wife spoke for you?" He swallowed hard. I remember. "I remember too," I said. My voice shook, but I didn't stop. "I remember standing there, waiting for you to say something. Anything, to tell her she was wrong, to tell me I wasn't a burden. But you didn't. You let her speak, and you stayed silent. You stood next to her when she kicked out her own mother." Alan's face crumpled. His hands gripped the edge of the table. I thought it was the only way to keep the peace. I thought if I sided with her, it would calm her down, and later I'd fix it. I told myself it was temporary, but I see now. I see what I did." "You stood with her," I repeated, my voice low. "And I walked out that door with nothing. I slept in a motel, Alan. I ate sandwiches from vending machines. I cried myself to sleep clutching your father's sweater because my son, my own son, had made me feel unwanted in his home. Tears filled his eyes, spilling over. Mom, I was weak. I was a coward. I wanted peace so badly that I let her destroy everything that mattered. And I let you suffer for it. I leaned back, my arms folded tightly across my chest. You wanted peace, Alan, but what you gave me was silence. And silence can be the cruelest weapon of all. He lowered his head, his shoulders shaking. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if it can be fixed. She's unraveling. She screams about you every day. She says I betrayed her, that I should be fighting you, not questioning her. She doesn't understand. She never will. I let him sit with his grief. I didn't reach across the table, didn't soothe him like I used to when he was a boy. Instead, I let him taste the bitterness of his choices. This isn't about fixing it, I said finally. This is about living with what you chose. You let Cassandra drive me out. You let her dictate who your mother was in your own home. And now, for the first time, you are seeing what it feels like when someone else controls your life. Alan lifted his head slowly. His eyes, swollen and red, searched mine. Do you hate me? I didn't answer immediately. Hate wasn't the right word. I felt pain, yes. Anger, yes. But beneath it all, I felt something harder to name, a cold satisfaction that he finally understood, even dimly, the consequences of silence. No, I said at last. I don't hate you. But I don't trust you either. His face crumpled again. He nodded slowly, accepting the words like a sentence passed down. He stood shakily, his hands trembling. I don't deserve your trust. Or your forgiveness. But I'll keep coming back. I can't go on like this anymore. I didn't stop him as he walked to the door. I didn't hug him or tell him it would be all right. I let him leave, carrying the weight of his choices with him. When the door closed behind him, I sat in silence, my hands clasped tightly together. My heart hurt. Of course it did. He was my son. But beneath the ache was something steadier, strength. For the first time in years, I wasn't begging for his love or his attention. I wasn't living in the shadow of his approval. I had spoken my truth, and I had watched it land. Alan had cracks now. Cracks in his marriage, cracks in his certainty, cracks in the wall of silence he had built around me, and I didn't need to smash those cracks open. I only needed to let them spread on their own, because no matter how loud Cassandra raged, no matter how hard she tried to deny it, Alan now knew the truth. He had seen the night through my eyes. He had heard the words he tried to bury, and from that moment on, things could never go back to what they were. The neighborhood association meeting was held in the community hall, a squat brick building with a leaky roof and folding chairs that groaned under the weight of decades. I hadn't attended a meeting in years, not since David was alive. He used to enjoy them, sitting in the back row with his arms crossed, listening to complaints about trash pickup and lawn ordinances as though they were matters of state. When the notice came that the quarterly meeting was scheduled, I knew Cassandra would be there. She liked to be seen, liked to play the part of the polished homeowner who cared deeply about community matters. I also knew the whispers about their escalating rent and financial strain had already circulated. The perfect stage had been set, and I decided I would no longer remain a shadow. That evening, I dressed deliberately. A tailored navy dress, a string of pearls I hadn't worn since David's funeral, and a cream-colored coat that set me apart from the sea of casual sweaters and windbreakers. When I walked into the hall, conversations quieted for a moment, eyes flicking toward me before darting away again. I found a seat along the side wall, folder tucked neatly in my lap. Cassandra arrived 10 minutes later, Alan trailing behind her like a man carrying invisible chains. She was in a crimson dress, too sharp for the modest gathering, her smile wide and brittle as she greeted neighbors with practiced warmth. But beneath the surface, I saw the tension in her jaw, the glint in her eyes. She knew I might be here. She suspected. The meeting began with the usual announcements: landscaping schedules, budget allocations, complaints about speeding in the cul-de-sac. My mind barely registered the words. I was waiting, poised, for the inevitable, and it came. Before we adjourn, Cassandra said suddenly, rising to her feet, I have something to bring to everyone's attention. A matter of fairness. Murmurs rippled across the room. Cassandra thrived on these moments, on the chance to hold court. She placed her hands on the back of her chair, her smile brittle but commanding. As many of you know, she continued, Alan and I have lived here for years. We've paid our dues, supported community projects, and always followed the rules. But recently, we've become victims of predatory practices. Our home, through some underhanded maneuvering, was bought at auction by a company called Stays Holdings. They've tripled our rent, threatened us with eviction, and refused to provide transparency about who's behind it. And I think everyone should know the truth about the kind of people moving into our community. Gasps and whispers spread through the room. Eyes turned toward Alan, who stared at the floor, his face pale. Cassandra basked in the attention, convinced she was rallying sympathy. It was then that I stood. The scrape of my chair against the floor echoed in the silence. Every head turned. My folder was steady in my hands, my chin lifted. Cassandra, I said, my voice carrying through the hall, if you want transparency, you shall have it. Stays Holdings is me. I am the owner of your house. The room erupted in murmurs. Cassandra's smile shattered. Her face went slack, then twisted into disbelief. You? Yes. I stepped forward, unfolding the deed from my folder and holding it up for all to see. The foreclosure was public. The auction was fair. The purchase was legal. I did nothing in secret, nothing unlawful. I simply bought an opportunity that was available to anyone, and I stand by it. The whispers grew louder. A few neighbors nodded. Others exchanged stunned glances. Cassandra's face burned crimson. You! She stammered, her voice breaking into a screech. You snake! You parasite! You've been plotting against us all along! I looked directly at her. No. What I've done is legal, and more than that, it's just. You told me once that I was an extra mouth to feed, that I was a burden, and my son stood by you when you said it. You cast me out of that house, and now, by the law and by my own strength, that house is mine. Not as a burden, not as charity, but as ownership. The room was silent. Cassandra trembled with rage, her fists clenched, her lips curled. She's lying! Cassandra shouted suddenly, turning to the crowd. She's an enemy! She wants to destroy us, to tear our family apart. And then it happened. Alan, who had been silent as stone, finally raised his head. His voice, though soft, cut through the air like a blade. No, Cassandra. She's not the enemy, the room gasped. Cassandra spun to him, her mouth open. What did you say? Alan swallowed, his eyes meeting mine across the room. For the first time in months, I saw not the boy who had bowed his head in silence, but the man beneath, fractured but struggling toward truth. She's not the enemy, he repeated, louder this time. She's my mother. And the enemy is what we've allowed ourselves to become. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Cassandra's face twisted, her body rigid with fury. She tried to speak again, but no words came. Her power, for the first time, faltered in front of witnesses. I stepped closer, my voice calm, steady, unshaken. I don't need your approval. I don't need your sympathy. All I need is to live in the truth, that I have acted lawfully, that I have claimed what is mine, and that I will not be erased again. Cassandra, you may call me an enemy, but I stand here as a woman who knows her strength. And for the first time, so does my son Alan's eyes filled with tears. But he didn't look away. Cassandra turned from him to me, back and forth, her face breaking into disbelief and humiliation. Around us, the neighbors whispered, not with pity for her, but with a new respect for me. And in that moment, I felt it. Power. Not the cold, vengeful kind, but the kind that comes from standing tall in your own truth, in front of others who once thought you weak, the kind that cannot be taken because it was earned. I folded the deed back into my folder, straightened my coat, and sat down again, calm as the storm receded. Cassandra was left standing, trembling, humiliated. Alan sat beside her, silent, but no longer hers alone. For the first time since the night they cast me out, I was not the weak one. I was the one holding the ground beneath their feet. The days after the residents' meeting felt like a new season in my life. For the first time since David's death, and certainly since Alan and Cassandra cast me out, I woke each morning not with dread, but with a sense of steadiness. My ownership was no longer a whispered secret hidden behind the name of a company. I had spoken it aloud, in front of the very people who once might have pitied me, and I had stood tall. But the greatest shift wasn't in the neighbors. It was in Alan. He called me 2 days after the meeting. His voice was hesitant, unsure, like a man learning to walk again. "Mom," he said softly, "can I come over?" I agreed, though my chest tightened with conflicting emotions. When he arrived, I saw the difference immediately. He still looked tired, his shoulders still bent under the weight of Cassandra's fury, but there was something else in his eyes now. A flicker of resolve, a faint light that hadn't been there before. We sat at my kitchen table again, mugs of tea between us. He stared into his cup for a long time before speaking. "You embarrassed her," he said at last, "in front of everyone." "She hasn't stopped screaming about it." "I didn't embarrass her," I replied evenly. "I told the truth." "She embarrassed herself when she built her life on lies and entitlement." He nodded slowly, rubbing his thumb along the edge of his mug. "I know. I see it now. I should have seen it years ago, but I didn't want to. It was easier to let her run everything, easier to stay quiet. But when I heard myself say you weren't the enemy, it was like something broke open inside me. I realized I've been living her life, not mine." I watched him carefully. My heart ached for the boy I had raised, for the man who had lost himself in a marriage that fed on his weakness. But I didn't let that ache turn into softness. Not yet. "Words are easy, Alan," I said gently but firmly. "It's choices that matter now." He swallowed, his eyes glistening. "I want to make better choices. I want to be your son again." I didn't answer right away. The wound was still too raw, the memory of that night too vivid. But I let my silence speak for me. Not cruelly this time, but as space for him to fill with action rather than promises. And to his credit, he came again. And again. Sometimes he brought groceries. Sometimes he just sat with me in silence. Slowly, cautiously, we began to rebuild something fragile. Not reconciliation, not yet, but the first fragile bridge over a broken chasm. Cassandra, however, grew more unhinged. She began storming into neighborhood meetings, demanding that the association investigate me. She sent long, rambling emails to anyone who would read them, claiming I had tricked the courts, forged documents, stolen what was hers. Most ignored her, but her fury grew more erratic. Then came the threats. One morning, Lewis called me to his office. His expression was grave, though his eyes glinted with the calm confidence of a man who had prepared for this moment. "Barbara," he said, sliding a stack of papers across his desk. "Cassandra has hired her own attorney. She's threatening to expose your secret, that Harry Stays was your father, that your inheritance was hidden, that you somehow manipulated the trust to gain assets unfairly." I picked up the papers, scanning them. Cassandra's lawyer had written with all the bluster of someone grasping at smoke. Words like fraudulent, illegitimate, concealed identity. But underneath the noise, there was nothing. No evidence. No crime. "She thinks she's found your weakness," Lewis continued. "She believes if she tells the world your father was Harry Stays, it will shame you, strip away your position." He paused, then smiled faintly. "But Barbara, the law is on your side. The trust was legal. The inheritance was yours. And your parentage? That's no scandal. That's your truth, I felt a surge of calm wash over me. Cassandra had always believed power came from secrets, from whispers behind closed doors, from manipulation. She didn't understand that true power came from standing in the open, unashamed. Respond, I said firmly. Legally. Destroy her position. Make it clear she has nothing. And that's exactly what we did. Lewis drafted a letter so sharp it could have cut glass. He laid out the trust in meticulous detail, citing every legal precedent, every signature, every notarized page. He confirmed the legitimacy of my inheritance, the transparency of the auction, the airtight legality of my company's ownership. By the time the letter was finished, Cassandra's claims looked not only empty, but foolish. We didn't just respond privately. We filed the letter publicly through the court system, ensuring that Cassandra's threats became part of the record. Neighbors who had received her emails soon received copies of Lewis's rebuttal. The result was devastating. Where she had hoped to expose me, she only exposed herself as a woman grasping at straws, consumed by envy, blind with rage. When the news reached her, I heard about it from Alan. He came to me late one evening, his voice low, his expression weary. "She's broken," he said simply. "The lawyer dropped her. Neighbors won't listen to her anymore. She keeps saying you've ruined her life." I looked at him steadily. She ruined her own life. I only held up the mirror. Alan's eyes glistened, and for the first time in months, he reached across the table and touched my hand. Tentatively, like a child asking permission. "I don't know if you'll ever forgive me," he said quietly, "but I want to tell you, I'm proud of you. Proud you didn't let her destroy you. Proud you stood up for yourself in a way I never did." My throat tightened. Tears stung my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. Instead, I let his hand remain on mine, our silence filled not with bitterness this time, but with something softer. Not healing yet, but the possibility of it. Cassandra, meanwhile, faded. Her threats ceased, her voice grew quieter, her presence smaller. She had tried to destroy me with whispers, but I had answered with the law, and she had lost. For the first time, I felt not only strong, but untouchable.